this end.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our evening event today with Natalie Bennett to chat about Change Everything. So the book came out earlier this year. It came out with Unbound, who are a crowdfunding publisher and always worth looking at to see what else that people have helped put together and put out into the world. Natalie Bennett was, of course, the leader of the Green Party from 2012 to 2016.
Green Party of England and Wales, I have to say at this point.
And then entered the House of Lords here in 2019. So over the decade, been travelling around the country, speaking at public meetings, schools, colleges, universities, and hearing all about grassroots movements across the country that are trying to tackle various polycrises that we're handling. Degrees in agricultural sciences, humanities and social sciences. I'm also a biologist, theologist by trade, so we might geek out a little bit. And would like to sort of reflect the passion for intersectional thinking in the book, which is pretty obvious as we'll see, rather than reductionist 20th century style Victorian thinking. I'm Hannah, I'm a senior bookseller here at Lighthouse, and really looking forward to chatting about the book. So as I said, it's from Unbound. I think one thing or phrase or quote from it that really sums it up is that politics should be what you do and not what is done to you, and that's really a thread through the whole book. So I would like to ask you to kind of give a bit of an overview of the structure and the purpose of the book. Why did you write it?
Okay, well, I think it's worth starting out. Perhaps a couple more things about me, so you don't have to sit there wondering. The accent comes from Australia originally. And I have to say it's lovely to be back in Edinburgh. I was first here in 2011 for the Scottish Parliament elections, where I learnt, in delivering leaflets, I learnt about Edinburgh tenement buildings. My knees still remember those Edinburgh tenement building steps. But about the book, and I think it's probably worth reflecting on the Unbound, the crowdfunding aspect for a second, because that was a very deliberate political choice. Because if you look back into the sort of the 18th or the 17th century, books were mostly sponsored by an aristocrat who gave the author the money to print it. And so, there's a lovely poem in the front saying how wonderful the aristocrat is. And I think this is a lovely alternative model of doing things, in that people put in 10 quid if they were going to get an ebook, and that people putting in their 10 quids, that's what funded the book to be printed, and all of their names are in the back. So that's a model, and one of the things I talk about is thinking about how we fund research, we fund thinking a bit in the future, is that actually we some people are already doing this. Richard Murphy, the economist, for example, essentially funds his work through Patreon. So people actually sponsor, put in a tenner or a 20 quid or a month or something, and lots of people doing that actually funds people to do academic work. And I think we're thinking about how we build a different kind of academia, a different kind of thought system. That's a really important thing of doing it. But this book is also crowdfunded in two ways, because it's also, what it contains is essentially what I've been saying at public meetings up and down, I say the country, that mostly means England, I confess that, but up and down the country, and occasionally in Scotland, for the past 12 years or so, since I became leader in 2012. And so this has been tested on audiences of everything from the Women's Institute in Sefton Park, to college students in Liverpool, to people all around the country. And you'll find, if you read the book, that there's lots of stories of what people have actually told me that's informed my thinking, and that I'm also sharing with other people. So perhaps my classic case study for this is the first chapter of the book is about universal basic income, which I think is not just a policy, but a foundation for a different kind of society. And one of the people I quote there was actually, I was doing a Skeptics in the Pub, which is a wonderful group that does literally meetings in pubs talking about stuff. And I was talking about universal basic income with Skeptics in the Pub in Barnsley. And this guy sort of put his hand up and said, well, I've realised that the state pension is sort of a bit like a universal basic income. And I got my state pension a couple of years ago, and now on Mondays I do the Men in Sheds group, and on Tuesdays I run the Allotment Society, and on Thursdays I look after the grandkids, and on Fridays I do this. I don't know how I ever found time to do paid work. And so, as an answer to people who say, "Oh, well, what will happen with universal basic income? People will just sit on the sofa and do nothing." That's a great way to answer. Here's someone who's got something like a UBI, and what a great, contribution they're making to society. And the reality is, when we think about it, lots of people are making contributions to society that are not paid work, but are absolutely crucial. And actually, I was in Glasgow at a wonderful group some people may know called Gal Gale. I think they're in the book too. Sorry, forgive my pronunciation. Australian vowels, that's my excuse. And they work doing woodwork with people with drug and alcohol and mental health issues. And we were there talking about what a UBI would be like for them. And they said, this area of Glasgow, there's so many things that need doing, but there's no paid work. And what about if we just funded people to do the things that need doing? And that's what a UBI could do. So it's actually all those stories like that I've heard from people like that. And there's a limited number of places I can go and places I can talk. So the book is the supplement, the extra, reaching many more people like that.
Sort of organised a lot of those case studies and stories into subjects and sections that relate to then moving to policy, and then what the Green Party and Greens could do with those policies, those stories, those people. So you cover universal basic income quite a lot in the first part about active freedom. Also covered in there is decommodifying time, lifelong education, undemocratic democracy, it's really hard to say, restoration over gentrification, societal progress over advancing technology, and loads more things. And one proposal that kind of covers a lot of those was the idea and the concept of people's assembly, and how the results of those can often be more progressive than the decisions that are made by politicians. So I was wondering if there was anything that's top of your list of issues that you think could be put to people's assembly. What would you like to see in people's hands?
Oh, I think I'm going to pick two things out there. One of which is, we've already had this, but much more can be done with it, which is the climate issue generally. And the great case study for this was we have had a People's Assembly, a climate assembly. Unfortunately, it was right over the very start of COVID, and so it kind of got buried. But at about the same time, France had one, and it's such a wonderful case study because in France they had a People's Assembly to say, what do we do about the climate? And they said, okay, what we should do is stop all flights where the train journey is less than 4.5 hours. Fairly obvious, the reasons for it very clear, but then they went to the politicians. So that was the People's Assembly, a representative group of people from all around France got together, and it was a dialogue they had with each other and got to 4.5 hours. And then it got to the politicians. And the politicians, probably nobbled by the airline industry, went, ooh, that's a bit radical, isn't it? And so the politicians eventually went for 2.5 hours. So they stopped flights where the train journey is less than 2.5 hours. Who would fly in that anyway? Although apparently, actually, since that's come in, they have cut airline emissions in internal flights in France a bit. But 4.5 hours would have been a lot more. But if we were going to pick the one thing that I'd say now is, one of the things that I say very clearly in the book is the UK. I'm separating Scotland out here, but the UK, as in Westminster, is not a democracy. And we have Sir Keir Starmer now with 34% backing from the people who voted. If you look at turnout, that takes it down to about 30%. If you look in missing millions of people who aren't on the electoral roll, the current government in Westminster represents about 25% of people. That's not a democracy. So what do you do? One of the big problems is, what's your theory of change? How do you get from where we are now in Westminster? And I suspect people probably know this, but the Scottish Green Party is a pro-independence party. As the Green Party of England and Wales, we take our position from Scotland, so we are a pro-independence party for Scotland, and our Welsh party is now also pro-independence. But park all of that to one side and say, let's imagine the UK as we are for the moment, or even if it was just England. How do we get from where we are now, the constitution that's been accreted by centuries of historical accident, how do we actually draw up a modern, functional, written, democratic constitution? The People's Assembly, to me, is the obvious way to do it. which doesn't mean they have to write every subclause, but they can set out what the principles are of how the country wants to be governed. And then, one of the key things is the questions about people's assemblies is, do they have the final say? And I think they should have the final say. I think they would say, we want a proportional representation system, we want the number of seats to match the number of votes. I would think that people would say we want far less power and resources concentrated in Westminster, we want it back in local communities. So all of those things I think they would say, but it should be up to that People's Assembly, the participatory, deliberative democracy, to decide.
And I think one of the things that you finished that chapter with, not only would it be that, but it would also be reviewed. You'd have a timeline. You would go back and you would revisit it. It wouldn't just be, something that's been around for hundreds plus years.
It's one of the things that gets me is, so many Americans, and the US is the extreme case of this, is it clearly has a totally broken constitution. I mean, for example, the Electoral College, which was put in the interests of the slave states. And yet no one ever seems to talk about changing the constitution because it's just too difficult. And it's supposed to be this wonderful thing they were taught at school, to put your hand on your heart and sing the anthem. So I think what you would want to do is having, every 20 years have a review and say what's working, what's not working. Because nothing it's going to work forever and nothing's going to be perfect. So we come back to sort of some scientific principles. Let's have an experiment, see how it goes, and then adjust things after you see the results.
Got your results section, your conclusion. A little bit in the first chapter as well talks about education and the importance of it happening throughout our lives, various different subjects in different ways. And then at one point you mentioned the part of your lifelong learning was to just pop along to, I think it was the British Library, and do some research on Chinese warrior women. And then nothing else was mentioned, so I've got to ask about that. What was that?
Okay, well that was actually my in my second degree. So my first degree was agricultural science. I did a thesis on abomasal bloat in goat kids. Okay, anyone who wants to ask me about that later, I won't bore the general audience, but I will explain abomasal goat. But my second thesis was essentially Asian. Second degree was Asian studies, history and politics.
From your time based in Thailand.
No, well, this was still when I was in Australia. But I actually read a book about, it was talking about a young American woman who grew up hearing all of these stories from Chinese history about warrior women. And it's interesting because this piqued my interest. This is back, this is 30 years ago now. And there's this stereotype you think about from sort of pre-communist China, women with bound feet, lots of oppression of women. And yet there's actually, when you start to read Chinese myths and legends, and there's all of these women who, absolute total swashbuckling, jumping on their horse, waving their sword around, leading their warriors into battle. There's a whole lot of stuff like that. And so I just went off and explored some of those, and I actually went to China at the time and found some text then. And I think I have the capacity to get interested in almost any subject. I mean, I should tell you that downstairs we were talking about how yeast cells communicate with each other. I can get very geeky about science, but I can also get very geeky about history. And one of the things, I mean, when you look at right through everything I've done, I became a feminist at age 5 because I was told, because you're a girl, you're not allowed to have a bicycle. And that came from my very aspirational working class grandmother in Australia. I've been a feminist ever since, and one of the things I love uncovering is women in history in all sorts of amazing places. So I actually started a book on the history of the women of London before the Green Party took over my life. And there's a woman called Isabella Whitney, who was the first non-aristocratic woman to have poetry published in the UK. And she's absolutely wonderful, Isabella Whitney. One of probably her best work, most accessible work now is her last will and testament, where she actually describes the London of Elizabeth I. And so she's leaving to London everything that's there. And so one of the lovely lines in this is that she was a sort of middle class, in modern day terms, middling sort. She says she wishes she was rich enough to be in the debtor's prison, because you had to be seen to have status and money before anyone would lend you money. Mm-hmm. And it's a really interesting case study of, in Elizabethan London, class differences, if we like, in modern terms.
Right, speaking of having enough money.
Yes. I thought we'd get back to politics that way.
We'll dip in and out. We'll be clear. The second part of the book is called True Prosperity, and talks actually beyond finance and what prosperity really is, and it's a lot more to do with restoring the earth, the monstrosity of monocultures and wasteful agriculture, and the power that finance has and why it shouldn't have as much as it does, and looking at things that are more about prosperity, that make us feel more prosperous, like social capital, and the concept of bioregions, which I thought was quite cool. Sorry, we're back on biology. It's happened already. So I'm going to ask that question first, and then I'll go back to another. You talk about I don't know, I'm going to say it wrong, it's a French word, terroir concept. Which,
well, don't go by my French accent either, but anyway.
Or bioregions, where the focus on what you buy, eat, grow in your area is really looking at what's the unique thing about it. So what do you have in your area that has the best flavour, that grows really well, or has really high yield, that is a regional thing, and then to really focus on making that part of the local sort of capital, social capital. So I didn't know if you had any ideas of things that you have for maybe South Yorkshire, where you spent a lot of time, or for here I'd say first thing that came to my mind was Scottish drinking water. It's just, having lived all across the UK, it's so much better.
Well, I think, perhaps I'll take this out really. I'm not an expert on Edinburgh, so I won't take this into regional specifics, but thinking from the other side of how terrible it is now, in that around the world, more than 50% of human calories come from just 4 crops. And so what we've done is, wheat, rice, maize, and soya. Now, what we've done is we've insisted that wheat be planted all around the world. And a few years ago, the UN had a year of millets, and they were trying to promote millet in Africa, which is a tougher crop, more drought resistant, far more nutritious, fitted to local, diets, what traditionally people have eaten. But we've had the multinational companies come in and say, but we want wheat. And the multinational buyers, if you want to have a cash cropping economy, well, millet, we don't really know what to do with millet. We just want wheat. And there's a fascinating history with this, because actually, if you go back into the history, in peasant society, Scotland, of course, mostly there's a reason you have oatcakes, which is, wheat really struggles in Scotland. And there's some interesting example, because actually a lot of the wheat that used to be grown in Scotland, they say they're cutting this down. Because it didn't dry off, it was sprayed with glyphosate. 10 days before harvest or so, you spray the wheat with glyphosate to kill it off, so then you can harvest it dry, because you were never meant to grow wheat in Scotland anyway. But historically, right through the UK, peasants wanted to grow something they called maslin, which was a mixture of oats, barley and rye, because those are 3 things that are quite tough. They cope in Scotland as well with shorter summers, with colder weather, with wetter weather. But the aristocrats, the local lord, wanted to eat white bread, because that was the high status stuff. Just like the ancient Romans wanted to eat white bread because it was high status. There's a line running right through this. And so peasants would be forced by their local lord to grow wheat, even when they didn't want to. And you think about where we are now, we're in that same situation. And just a couple of other things. I can talk about the food system forever, but I won't. But I spent a lot of time in the House of Lords talking about the genetic technology (precision breeding) bill. Oh no, it bloody well isn't. And one of the interesting things about this is that this, of course, applies to England. So it's because we're covering devolved areas. So England, and we're going to be doing more on this in the coming months, is going to have GMOs, genetically modified crops. And of course those seeds are all going to know to stop at the border, because they're not legal in Scotland. Always.
No wind there.
No, definitely not. So there's a whole area there in terms of, but I kept hearing that we've got to feed the world. I'm sure we've all heard the feed the world story. Well, in the UK, half of arable land that's ploughed up with crops growing on it, half of that crop is going to either feed animals in factory farms or to produce biofuels. In the US, it's 2/3. Now, taking what could be perfectly good food that humans could eat and feeding it to animals to get a tiny fraction of meat at the end of it, of what you've put in, that is pure food waste.
The line that really got me about that was that it takes 10 calories of energy for every 1 nutritional calorie of energy that you get out. It's just such a huge imbalance.
Well, that's actually about our current industrial farming with the crops.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's even worse. The ratios are even worse with animals. But it's we'll hear, but we've got to have modern agriculture. Modern agriculture, the green revolution, is how we feed the world. But actually now, where you've got the tractor that ploughs the field up, then harrows it, then plants, then every few days sprays pesticide over the field. Look out from the train window when you see, and there's all those tracks in the fields where you can see where the tractor probably going up and down every few days. The amount of energy, 10 calories of energy, mostly from fossil fuel, goes in to get 1 calorie of food out. We go back to pre-fossil fuel days, essentially horse-drawn ploughs. You put 1 calorie of energy in to get 3 calories of food out. So anyone who tells you that modern agriculture is efficient is talking through their hat.
Those measures of efficiency need some scrutinising. Something else that we discussed in this chapter, and it kind of links in, because rather than having big monopoly companies across industries, it's a lot more about the sharing economy, which can lead to helping out with our food security and intense problem with overconsumption. So you mentioned things like Library of Stuff. Up here in Edinburgh, we have the Tool Library, which just had its 10-year anniversary. Lots of community gardens, repair cafes.
And I have to say on the Tool Library thing, from the Tool Library or the Library of Things in Totnes, I learned that the average electric drill is used for 15 minutes in its entire life. So you think about people need to put up a shelf, so they go and buy a drill. And how often do they then use that drill again? And the other Library of things that I think is always great is, the guitar. Child says, "Oh, I want to learn the guitar." Mum or Dad goes off and buys a guitar. 5 lessons later, child has decided they don't really want to learn the guitar. Guitar sits in the loft. If you've got a Library of Things, you can go and borrow one to find out if the child likes it. And maybe if they really get into it, you might end up buying one, but most of them probably not.
And you talked about the sharing being a solution or a partial solution for space as well. Not everyone has a loft to put their stuff that they don't need or want in anymore. So
and that's where we get into housing policy too, because we think about Britain's houses on average are about a third smaller than the houses they build in continental Europe. So in London, and I'm sure in Edinburgh too, the new luxury apartment, which has 2 double bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. And the second double bedroom, you can put a double bed in it, and you can walk down beside the double bed as long as you kind of cross your ankles over when you're walking down beside the double bed. And I talk in the book about fast fashion, and fast fashion has enormous environmental impacts. But the right wing will say, well, people just want to buy new stuff all the time. But if you live in one of those luxury apartments with no storage, where you've got to, tiptoe down beside the bed, you buy a new winter coat each year, because where do you store it over the summer? There's nowhere to put it. So that's the way our life is designed, is to consume. And it's a general thing that, it's really worth saying is the right wing likes to say, well, people want this and this is what people are choosing. Well, I'm not concerned with individual behaviour, I'm concerned with system change. So we make the environmentally responsible and socially responsible thing to do the easiest, cheapest and simplest thing to do. So if you have a good storage cupboard and a decent amount of space, you can just keep the coat. But at the moment, lots of people's, and every 6 months, you're certainly in, I know it's a bit different here, but lots of people get forced to move every 6 months because the landlord puts the rent up. And your mate's helping you out with the back of their van, but how much space have they got and how much stuff do you leave behind?
Which kind of leads me to how do we make these basically grassroots community efforts a lot more mainstream? So the things that seem to have worked but probably have their own inherent issues, things like Depop and Vintage, it's much more mainstream than something like sharing libraries and tool libraries. How do we get them up there as a...
Well, I think that, my whole sort of argument for how we rebalance this is that actually, in economist terms, there's things called externalised costs. So you think about the £5 T-shirt you can buy in Primark. I mean, I came up off the train station, watching people all in the big clothes stores in town, in the centre of Edinburgh. You can probably buy a £5 T-shirt there. Think about where that £5 T-shirt comes from. Perhaps cotton grown in Azerbaijan, where a child's forced out of school to pick the cotton. Fossil fuels shipped over to China, spun into cloth in a factory that spews dye into the nearest river. Fossil fuels to Bangladesh, where it's sewn up in a sweatshop garment factory. People might recall Rana Plaza about 10 years ago, where more than 1,000 women died when the factory collapsed. Then shipped back to the UK, sold in a shop where people are on 0 hours contract minimum wage jobs, and it's all £5. Now the real cost of that is vastly more than £5. So how do we balance that? Is put the real cost on the price tag, and then something that's socially and environmentally responsible can compete. But of course that's why I talk about system change, because there's lots of people now, you've got a job interview on Monday and you really need the job and you want a crisp white T-shirt, so you go and buy that £5 T-shirt even though you know it's going to turn into a rag in 5 minutes time, in 3 washes time. Well, the only thing I'm going to say to you as an individual is good luck in the job interview.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to change the system so people can afford to pay the proper price for things, and everyone has the wage that affords that, and then the real price is on the price tag.
So individual consumer choice can only get us so far.
Not very far.
So yeah, the next part of the book is overarchingly called Healthy Life, but really looks at not beyond just health, it's well-being, culture and space. So kind of 3 strands that you looked at, really focusing on prevention over treatment across healthcare, well-being, everything. But one thing that I really kind of clicked onto and just kind of conjured up an image straight away was art deprivation. And something I'd never really thought of or put in those terms, and especially in the UK in comparison to continental Europe. And the first thing I thought of was our many beautiful but ticketed and private art and sculpture parks. So there's a lot of art around, it's just you've got to pay to go see it. So you talk a little bit about the green alternative for access to culture. Can you talk about that and the importance for creativity?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you go to continental Europe, you'll find, you visit some out of the centre of a city, some little suburban shopping centre, and there'll be, a great mural covering the whole side of one building, and then there'll be, a really interesting sculpture and some work done with the local school, perhaps a temporary sculpture in the park. And we have proportionately so much less of that in the UK. And, but what will the Daily Mail say? Mm-hmm. They've spent money on art when they could have done it to something to encourage the economy. But also, I think, what we've seen, this is perhaps particularly English, Scotland I think is probably not quite so bad, but we've seen Michael Gove at work, and creative subjects have just been totally killed in English schools, English education. And there's lots of people now who are starting to tear their hair out about the fact that it's basically only people who've been to fee-paying schools who are going into art, because they're the only people who studied art at school. But I think this is about much more than just jobs, and in fact, because I'm a little bit mad, I'm working on my next book, 100,000 words for Routledge by January. I'll say that really quickly. Art needs to be what everyone does. And I've been reading about particularly sort of Latin America, Central America, even parts of the southern parts of North America. there's no word for art in most of the languages. There's something that describes doings, and you're doing things in what you might call a mindful kind of way. You're aiming to sweep the street in a really active way. There's a lovely thing in Sri Lanka called a kolam, Kolam, which is a Tamil tradition, whereby women first thing in the morning, that's part of the gender aspects of this for the moment, but women first thing in the morning go out and paint an incredibly elaborate pattern in rice flour on their front doorstep. And this is beautiful, lots of geometry in it, lots of fancy, beautiful patterns, traditionally painted in rice flour. And I was actually reading a book about this, and someone uncovered the fact that the origins of this tradition were when you built this house, you displaced lots of creatures. You took away their homes. And so you put the rice flour out, but in this beautiful, artistic, creative pattern, and the beetles and the bugs and the ants and everything else come and take it away, and you're recompensing them, doing something beautiful and recompensing them. So there's all kind of ways in which we need to build art into everyday life, and we've just split things down and say, but is it about the economy? And what will it do for the economy? And my basic starting point is that we have to stop saying that what can we do for the economy, and say what can the economy do for us?
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about the economy being kind of the leading decision maker for most of our systems at the moment, but there are certain things that have obvious benefits for the individual, but then on a broader sense as well. And one of the examples that you use is right to roam, so access to
well done, Scotland.
Yeah, exactly. So we've had it since 2003. I think it has been for a long time part of Green Party policy to try and get it for England as well. So we know what individual health benefits exposure to green areas can have. It's going out into the green areas is prescribed by doctors. That's become quite mainstream. You then talk about broader improvements and kind of the visibility of those previously private areas. So what else we see as a community and what we can report and what we can improve.
Yes, I spent quite a bit of my time campaigning against for a ban on driven grass shooting, and the whole shooting industry and what the shooting industry. In fact, the 1st of October is the start of the pheasant shooting season, and there's an organisation called Wild Justice that's been doing great work on this in terms of basically massive pheasants, which are an exotic, not a native bird. Massive quantities of them are released into the wild, often near areas of special scientific interest, etc. They not only do they eat invertebrates, reptiles, lots of endangered things, they also create a huge amount of basically feast for foxes and crows. And so then the gamekeepers go out and kill all the foxes and crows of the sort of kind of slaughter that's happening in the hunting fields. So, from Sheffield and looking at the Peak District, there's been a lot of work done by people who walk on the moors and who just understand what's happening up in the Highlands. There's something horrendous, and I apologise, I will make this not too awful in case anyone at home is eating dinner, but there's something called stink pits, whereby gamekeepers kill lots of animals and then dump all the carcasses into the stink pit, and then they put traps around so that any carnivores that come to the stink pit then get caught, and so there's more carcasses to throw into the stink pit. And it's when people are walking around spaces that they find things like this and are absolutely horrified by them. And this kind of comes back to the point we started on, talking about citizen science, people being involved in research, democratising it. One of the things that you can do is, you can send, for Right to Roam, send the whole class out, day's project, go out and count the dragonflies. And let's every year do that as a one-day project, and then let's look at how the dragonflies are doing each year in succession. We collect some data, we show young people about what's out there in the world. There's all kinds of things like that we can do.
Yeah, I bet you get more reports on, so lots of farms get subsidies for doing farming in certain ways, having maintaining hedges, having wildflower areas. They might not always be there, but if everyone's out and about walking in the countryside, they might be able to report on it as well. So we get more accountability across our landowners and land access as well. How are we doing for time?
It is 7:36.
But that was the third part of the book. I'll do a little bit on the last part and then we'll see what questions you've all got. So the final part is resilience and covers, I guess, what you might be thinking of as the 3 R's. We've got repairing, rebalancing and reparation. So this covers repairing broken systems, a couple that you mentioned quite a lot on prison and legal systems, rebalancing foreign policy and moving away from things like Americanization, which some people refer to as globalization, talking about a universal declaration of human rights, which is very interesting, and then looking at colonial genocide, new colonialism, as you've termed it, and fair trade over just more trade. So one of the examples that I landed on was that you referred to a couple of case studies on foreign policy. You mentioned Finland as a beacon of hope against case studies like royalist Thailand and Americanization of international relations. So what is it about Finland? What are they doing that is so good?
Well, if you look at whether it's the education system, and in Finland they don't start formal education until 2 years later than we do. They have the best results in the world. They don't focus on external exams until right at the end of school. But also, much more broadly than that, there is no homelessness in Finland. I've been to Helsinki a couple of times, and there's just no homelessness. There's no homeless people on the streets at all. There's so many things they're doing right. But what's really hopeful about the Finland story was I went to their People's History Museum. And what's astonishing, during what we call the First World War, they had the war between the Reds and the Whites, which was roughly the Conservatives and the Communists, in a very rough sense. And it was a genocidal, hideous slaughter. The photos reminded me of the Rwandan genocide. In the People's History Museum, there's photos of rows of soldiers with their hands tied behind their backs with their throats cut. There's babies with their brains bashed out. And that was Finland not much more than 100 years ago. That's what was happening. And you look at Finland is now, by most measures, one of the most successful countries, if not the most successful country in the world, with a democratic system that works. It's interesting because one of the reasons I went there was they were running a trial on universal basic income, and the civil servants are really sick of all the fangirls who come to visit them. Because all of these study tours from all around Europe and beyond turn up and go, wow, your social security system is amazing. Wow, your housing system is amazing. And they keep going, no, we're not doing this right. We should be doing better on that. But Finland is just such a great story that tells you anywhere in the world can rebuild from the worst possible place that you could possibly imagine. It can be done. It has been done.
In a fairly short time scale as well.
But the other thing is, looking at what's happened since the Second World War, I think there's a narrative that the Americans and many people in the UK still run, which is, liberal democracy. We've been trying to promote democracy and human rights around the world. But people just won't swallow it. They won't accept it. They won't do it. But if you actually go, and I quote a book called The Jakarta Method, and this is just one example of really telling. It's called the Jakarta Method because when President Suharto, with CIA American support, was taking over Indonesia, 1 million people, best estimate, were slaughtered extrajudicially. 1 million people. Significant numbers of them were members of the Indonesian Communist Party. Many of them were only the mildest kind of leftists you could possibly imagine. And this was all done with CIA backing, with CIA training, with CIA support. And then the CIA exported that method of controlling the leftists all around the world. There's a list of 33 countries where the Jakarta method was deployed. If you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I've long had an interest in, there was President Lumumba, democratically elected, handed over by the CIA and the Belgians to the opposition to be killed. why has democracy not been able to take root around the world? Why do we not have the rule of law? It's not because we were trying, it's because we were suppressing it. And my argument is that one of the things we have to do, how do we find a place for Britain in the world? Goodness knows what's going to happen with America. America is withdrawing from the world anyway. We don't want to be, following America into the next Iraq or Afghanistan. We're not part, I hope this will change in the future, but currently we're not part of the European Union. What's the UK's place in the world? And I would say that, how do we rebuild, there's so much negativity around the state of the world at the moment, but I'm always looking for the hope, looking for the positivity. And there's lots of other countries in the world. And I finish off by talking about the call for a global ban on nuclear weapons, the UN treaty that we now have for a global ban on nuclear weapons, backed by a majority of the world's countries, more than 120 countries backwards, who of course are not the nuclear armed states themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And what could be more neo-colonial than threatening the whole planet with destruction? Mm-hmm. And what could be more of a signal of Britain taking a different place in the world than us saying, well, we're going to sign the global ban on nuclear weapons. We are going to get rid of our nuclear weapons. And so, this is my, I always like to focus on hope. And where do I get my hope from? My basic underlying hope is where we are now is profoundly unstable. The one thing I can guarantee you is that in 5 or 10 years' time, things will be really different. And that's great news. Because then we have the potential, the possibility to build something different. And, in international affairs, where people often find the most depressing looking stuff, that's also true as well. We can be depressed about the horrors of the theocratic regimes in Iran and Afghanistan, but we can also look at the women, particularly, who were standing up in resistance to those regimes. And that's something to celebrate, and what we should be doing as a country is supporting those people, the genuine democratic efforts around the world.
Thank you. I think that kind of nicely wraps everything up. So I'm going to start opening up for questions. I'm going to start with one just to follow on from the looking for hope. Is there anything in the book or any research that you're finding out about recently that really gives you hope that you want to shout about?
Well, I think one of the things that is really clear is there's not so much research, but just, I travel around the country a lot. I'm visiting lots of wonderful bookshops like this one. And I haven't been to a place where there isn't just amazing things happening on the ground at the grassroots level. I think if I was in Ipswich, the Suffolk town, which in many ways looks like, and the locals will tell you, this place has gone so downhill. But there's a whole street where there's lots of small independent businesses and cafes. And when I was there, people were telling me, well, there's the community garden and the community food kitchen, the community this and the community that. All of these things are happening pretty well everywhere. The question is, how do we scale them up and make them the norm? And that's why I think UBI is so important, because most of us now, unless perhaps you're retired, most of us, we have a boss who tells us how to spend most of our time, energy and talents. In the old Soviet Union and models like that, the state told people how to spend their time, energy and talents. Well, UBI means people deciding for themselves how to spend their time, energy and talents. So Galgale in East Glasgow, people can decide, we're going to train people and help people to learn to work with wood, and the people who need our help and support, we'll keep supporting them whatever they need support, and eventually they can go out and help other people. And it's not that they're going to have to spend 36 hours a week applying for jobs they know they're not going to get, because the job centre has to tick off so that they get their inadequate universal credit. You free up I very much believe in human potential, human flowering, human possibility. If you free people from that dead hand of the boss, then so much is possible. And the other thing that really encourages me, and we were talking before about books I recommend, and I have to recommend David Graeber and David Wentzam, The Dawn of Everything. People may know David Graeber, who was the philosopher of the Occupy movement in New York. Also, I love him for inventing the phrase bullshit jobs, which is a description of what so many jobs that people are forced to do today are, and gave me the excuse of using the word bullshit in the House of Lords, because I was quoting an academic, so that had to be all right in parliamentary language. But David Graeber and David Winston talk about 300,000 years of human history. That's roughly how long our species, arguably, but more or less, have been on this planet. And the archaeology, the research is now uncovering far more than we had, because it was most of it was pre-writing. Humans have lived on this planet in all sorts of amazingly wonderful, different, creative, some of it looks totally mad to us now, ways. And so my next book originally had a working title. It was called Bury the Dead White Men. But it's been published with Routledge, and that's not a very Routledge title. And also, probably what the person I most want to bury is Francis Fukuyama, who's neither white nor dead, so that's a bit of a problem. But people may recall his end of history thesis, and this was in the 1990s after the Berlin Wall came down. And so his idea was basically this was the end of history. Human beings had reached the peak of their existence that they'd always been meant to achieve, living like 1990s neoliberal America, and that's the best possible way we could ever live, and the rest of the world is going to live, the whole world is going to live like that forevermore, which is such a blindingly stupid, on so many different levels, idea. But we have to get away from the idea that we can only live one way. But also, you were mentioning, we were talking about food and the lack of diversity. The next book, I was looking at an article about standout coffee shops around the world. You know what? They all look the same. And I'm sure you have a picture in your head of, the trendy, those light bulbs with the fancy filaments in them, where you can see the filaments hanging down industrially, probably exposed pipes, and possibly mismatched wooden furniture. All around the world, a trendy coffee shop looks the same. And I was actually in, many years ago now, but I was actually in North Korea, in Pyongyang. I went, having written on my visa form, I am not a journalist or writer of any kind, which was not actually true. Well, I worked for the Bangkok Post at the time, but I was quoting after I left there, Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist and later politician, wrote, "One world means no escape for anyone, anywhere." And one of the things we know from biology, from ecology, is that ecosystems that lack diversity are really fragile and really lacking in resilience. And one of the things we've done is we have, in that globalisation of cultural life, globalisation of way of living, there's a McDonald's everywhere. Everyone has the same mobile phone, more or less. All of those things.
Can you give an example of finding Vegemite in a cafe in...
That was actually in Sri Lanka, not just Vegemite. Okay, all right. I'm not properly acculturated. I prefer Vegemite to Marmite. I'm not properly acculturated, but this was the most ridiculous product you have ever seen in your entire life. This was an Australian product that I found in a little corner store equivalent in Sri Lanka, which consisted of 2 slices of plastic cheese, that American style craft sort of cheese, with a layer of Vegemite in between. Each one individually wrapped in plastic. If there's anything the world doesn't need, it's pre-wrapped Vegemite and cheese.
Does anyone have any questions in the room or from the online chat?
There's definitely a couple online, if you guys have your thinking caps on. This one is from Shala, who says, "Thank you so much for this. I'm wondering about democracy and participating in the systems as they exist. How did you approach becoming a peer or running for election in a broken democracy?"
Yeah, I get asked, thank you very much, Charlotte, for that. And I get asked this a lot, and I know this is perhaps in Scotland particularly controversial. I make absolutely no apologies about deciding to become a member of the House of Lords, because I was leader of the England and Wales Green Party from 12 to 16, and so I fought the 2015 election. And in that election, we Green parties across these islands got 1.1 million votes. And if we actually had a democratic system, that would have given us 25 MPs. Because we have the system we have now, we still only got the 1 MP, Caroline Lucas. And so when Theresa May, and so just to tell the story of how I came to be in the House of Lords, Theresa May offered the Green Party a seat in her resignation list. It was not a resignation list like Boris Johnson's or Liz Truss's, although she did appoint 4 members of her own staff, and I think the offer to the Green Party was a bit of a trade-off for that. And so the Green Party then democratically selected me to be the person who went into the House. So far as I'm concerned, I represent those 1.1 million people. I mean, we also don't believe in first past the post elections, but if you're going to get elected, obviously with exceptions like the Scottish Parliament, but and indeed Scottish Council elections, but in England, except London Assembly, if you're going to get elected, you have to stand in first past the post elections. So to change the system, I mean, I decided a long time ago when I first got involved in the Green Party, and back then in 2006, there was a lot of NGOs, a lot of campaign groups who were saying, well, you know, we're not going to do politics, we're just going to lobby whoever's elected and, you know, make them be a little bit better. But I thought back then, we have to stop electing the wrong people and hoping they'll do the right things, or trying to make them do the right things. So I don't think there's any alternative but to get Greens elected, or to get Greens in by this method, however method you can get. I mean, my aim is to, as I told the Yorkshire Post, my aim is to abolish my own job as soon as possible. I did actually, the first thing I did after my maiden speech was I trotted up to the bill office with the House of Lords elections and other reforms bill, which was for a fully elected House of Lords. So, you know, if you ask me if one word to describe what being in the House of Lords like is, it is strange. Very, very strange. And one of the things you do is you spend a lot of time and energy thinking about, do I follow the rules here or do I break them? And my basic principle approach is, if it's some pointless thing like when the mace is proceeded out past me at the end of the evening and the mace is supposed to represent the monarch, I bow, whatever, or at least I nod my head. But when they are passing a policing act that explicitly targets Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people, I said right through all the way, even though the rules say you should, or the unwritten rules say if you know you're going to lose a vote, you shouldn't call it. I said all the way through, I am going to call the vote on this section of the policing bill. So, you know, if you break every rule all the time, you're just kind of a loose cannon that people discount. So I follow lots of the small rules, and then when I think it really matters, like I put down a fatal motion to try and kill restrictions on trade unions, for example. You know, when it really, really matters, that's when I'll break the rules. And that's the way I operate on that basis. And, you know, as I said, I'm aiming to abolish my own job as soon as possible. Thanks for the question, Charlotte.
Anyone in the room?
I just wanted to ask about nuclear power, and I've heard that will Green Party ever get on board with it? I think a lot of people I speak to won't vote Green for reasons that are anti-nuclear power.
Just to summarise for the online in case they couldn't hear, the question is about nuclear power, and with improvements in safety, would the Green Party change their stance?
Yeah.
Well, I think first of all, there's many reasons to argue against nuclear power, and the safety argument is questionable. I was actually with Lord Baroness, who's actually, he's a crossbencher, but very, very, he used to be head of the Confederation of British Industry, and he believes in small modular nuclear reactors, and this is the Rolls-Royce plan, and I will guarantee to all of you that small modular nuclear reactors will never happen, certainly in the UK. But I was debating with Lord Baroness at Eton on the subject of nuclear power, and I made the, I mean, I knew I was going to lose the debate in terms of the vote at the end anyway, but I made the point to the boys and got the room thinking, because I said, okay, small modular nuclear reactors, let's put one in the courtyard. And you could just see the whole room go, well, that wasn't quite what we meant.
Safe for them, but not for us.
Well, but you know, you can argue about safety. You can argue about the fact that, of course, it's not renewable, and where there's most of the, at the moment, there's a huge problem because Russia controls most of the fuel. Lots of it is uranium mined in places like Niger. which is where it's actually been the treatment of the local people has fueled an Islamic insurgency in the country. Where is it mined? In Australia, they've destroyed huge amounts of indigenous land mining for uranium. There's all of those issues. But actually, I have no problem in saying why nuclear is totally not the answer. The reason why nuclear is a dead argument is nuclear is way too slow. You can put solar panels on the roof in a couple of months' time. You can put wind farms up in a couple of years' time. New nuclear, at the absolute best you can possibly imagine, is 12, 15 years away. And that's simply too slow. We are in the climate emergency now. I mean, you know, the Labor government down in Westminster, to give them some credit, is aiming to entirely decarbonise our electricity by 2030. Nuclear has no meaning for that. There's no new nuclear anywhere in that time frame. So there's all of those arguments, and there's also the fact that what kind of energy is nuclear, and lots of people don't know this, but lots of streetlights in the UK were actually put in when they built the first nuclear power stations, because the nature of a nuclear power station is you can't switch it on and off like a tap. You can't just, you know, switch the gas turbines off like you do with a gas turbine. You have to soak up that electricity. You have to use that electricity. And so, middle of the night when no one's got the kettle on and everyone's tucked up in bed and the heating's turned down, they actually had to find ways to soak up the power. It's a really inflexible source of energy. Whereas if you can manage renewables with storage, with energy management, there's plenty of papers, lots of research saying we can run the entire world on renewables. So why wouldn't we? When nuclear has all those other problems, is also very expensive. I haven't even mentioned the fact that it's enormously expensive. So it doesn't work. It's a failed dinosaur 20th century technology.
Anyone else in the room?
There's another one online. So Connor's asked us, I think in response to what you were saying earlier, Green Party policies have seemed so common sense to me for so long, and it felt like a new election system would put more Greens in power, but that very system change would also have opened more seats up to reform. So it seems to me that we need to fix our media first, so ideas get the same airspace. Can you offer your perspective on this?
Well, thanks very much, Connor, first of all, for the reaction about Green Party policies being common sense. In fact, the original subtitle of this book was Common Sense Politics for the Age of Shocks. But I got a new editor and they decided, I mean, I'm happy with the one I've got, but I still think both the Age of Shocks is a useful phrase and Common Sense Politics is a useful phrase. But I have no problems rebutting the arguments that proportional representation leads to the advance of reform, because, or lets the extreme parties in, because actually what really lets extreme parties into government, allows extreme parties to run governments, is first past the post. Undeniable evidence, Donald Trump. He took over one of two parties in a two-party system and ended up running the country, and I hate to say it, may well end up running the country, the US, again. I would say I suspect, well, maybe most of the room will agree with me. I think the last government we had in the UK was a far-right government. I was talking about passing a law that explicitly targeted Gypsy, Roma and traveller people. As far as I'm concerned, that fits the definition of far-right. And they also did, luckily, it's lucky that they were actually so incompetent and chaotic. Because actually, when you looked at some of the things, I mean, they got through the Elections Act that gave the Electoral Commission, control of the Electoral Commission to the government. This didn't get much attention at the time. They brought in voter ID, which was voter suppression straight out of the American far-right racist playbook. So what happens is, if you look at most of continental Europe, and there's Make Vote Matter, a brilliant organisation campaigning for proportional representation, and points out there is only one other first past the post system in the whole of Europe. That's Belarus, which is not a recommendation. For those who don't know, they're basically allied with Russia against Ukraine. And what happens in most of the rest of Europe is there's what's known as a cordon sanitaire, people get represented. You know, far right often gets 10, 15, sometimes even 20% of the vote. But the other parties say that's beyond the pale. You're represented in Parliament, but we're not going to form a government with you. So actually PR keeps the far right out of government. Whereas first past the post can and demonstrably has let the far right in both the UK and the US. And one might add Australia to that list as well. And I would say not giving people representation is actually deeply dangerous. I would say that the reason why we got the Brexit referendum result that we did was because of first past the post. The winning slogan was take back control. And lots of people, particularly in places like Northern England, who lived in usually Labour safe seats for generations, and they knew their vote didn't count, they didn't feel listened to, they were really angry and really fed up, and they lashed out by voting Leave. And I wrote a piece on this actually before the referendum result came out, saying that I don't think I entirely disagree with the Leave vote, but I understand people who feel like the current system doesn't give us a voice. We're going to strike out and try and stir things up. So I would say that PR is what ensures that people are represented, but they can be excluded from power in a way they can't be under the current system. Thank you.
Any more in the room? No? Okay, we're going to kind of get some books together and so we can get signed if you'd like to. I think we'll be around for a little bit.
Yep. Anyone who's feeling shy, I'm happy to answer questions individually afterwards. But make politics what you do not have done to you. Take that away with you.
Thank you, Natalie.